All right, can you guys hear me all right? Sweet. Doesn't even sound like it's on from up here. Okay, cool. So, my talk's called Bridging the Gap, and lots of people have had little. This earpiece is not good. Lots of people have had lots of jokes to say about it, but basically, yeah, let's get in. So, a bit about me. My name's Ben Corlett. That's my Twitter. So, if you'd like to be my second follower, definitely join. I work for Cardlist, and they make some awesome stuff. I've sort of called myself the lead developer, but to be honest, there's another guy, Bruno, who does a billion times more than I do, so I'm sort of like his second best. Cool. Oh yeah, I've got my little clicker. No, I don't. Hang on, bear with me. Haha, cool, awesome. I also work for a company called Webcom, which is my company. We've got 3 of us back in Australia. Work with Phil Sturgeon at Capture, and I'm just about to do my first Tuts Plus Premium article, which is exciting, which is on Behat. So check it out. It should be out in a week or 2. I'm Australian, and I'm not Texan, I'm not English, and I'm not Kiwi, and the reason I say that is because I have been asked. So yes, definitely Australian. There's 3 of us here, so that's a much better representation than we had back in the US. Cool, so some things I work on. Sentry, which is sort of like probably our biggest thing that we have at Cardlist that's just really taken off like wildfire. Laravel 4, and my little token thing is that at this stage, I've done a lot of pull requests and all that, mainly because when Taylor was writing it, I was also writing a bunch of stuff for work, and every day it was like, hey, Taylor, I'll fix this, or he'd basically break things, and then I'd come in and try and fix them, and he'd put new stuff. It was fun. So we work on platform, which is there, just curious, is there anyone here who is using any of Cardless stuff, any platform stuff, or, cool, oh wow, awesome, good on you, good work. All right, we've got around about 1 billion Cardless packages that you can use, but in fact it's around about 34. And I've just finished off an OAuth 1 client with the League of Extraordinary Packages. And what that is it's more of a joke. But basically, it was originally called the Super Best Friends Club, and it was this idea that Phil tweeted me drunk one night. He's like, dude, let's just get together and like get a few of us, we'll bring a bunch of awesome packages and all that. But if anyone wants to join, please do. The only criteria is that you have an awesome package which solves a problem. That's it. So if you have something, get in touch with us and join in, and yeah, it's really good fun. Pyro CMS, and I say that very carefully because I've only really done about 2 commits to it, which is quite often when I break Sentry, and then of course Pyro CMS breaks because I break Sentry. Fuel PHP, which I have done a couple of packages, and one of those packages was a PDF package, which is actually a great example of how not to do a package because it's that bad by today's standards in the way I wrote it, and there's probably more. I'm only saying that, but there probably isn't. My talk, why everybody needs PSR, I'm joking. All right, Composer. So we're going to talk a little bit about Composer, which is kind of, it's not as bad as you think because everyone's already sort of talked about it. Mine's a little bit of a different take on it. We're going to talk about Pre-Composer. Before Composer existed, you all had your framework of choice, right? Just curious, who here started on, say, CodeIgniter? Anyone? Yeah, like 99% of you. Fuel? Anyone start on Fuel? Yeah? Kohana? Zend? Don't show your hands. Laravel? Yeah, okay, so basically CodeIgniter. And some of you put your hands up twice, so yeah, anyway. So the framework did everything, all right? At least that's what it attempted to do, right? Problem was the framework always fell short. You always had to find something else that your framework didn't do, all right? So you made it working by finding a module, an extension, a package, a bundle, and God knows, I'm sure there's a bunch more terminology, but we're going to call them add-ons because otherwise, every time I reference them, I'm going to fill up a slide with just what they're called. So they're going to call them add-ons. What went wrong is that more frameworks appeared. So myself, I started on CodeIgniter, then all these other ones appeared. You switch around, you inherited projects, yeah. So here we go. I switched from CodeIgniter. I came in around 1.4. I think it was 1.4. It might have even been 1.7. I went to Kohana, then Fuel, back when it was called Carbon originally, Fuel, and this was around 2011. And then Thrust, which lasted about, must have been about 2 or 3 weeks, and it just had too many jokes about it, so we had to change the name of it. Then Laravel, sorry? Yeah, 1 week was it? Yeah, it wasn't long. And then Laravel 3.1 and Laravel 4. And I'm only saying them separately because architecturally Laravel 4 is just not even a similar framework. Yeah, so your new framework that you switched to didn't do all the things. And then of course you had a bunch of useless add-ons because your what's a good example? What's that really cool OAuth, right? That Ben Edmonds wrote. And everybody's used that, right? Everybody's used that. And then you switch over to, say, Laravel, and it didn't work. Or you switch over to Fuel, it didn't work. So life went on. And so what happened is your favorite add-ons were forked. All right, so I'm going to go through 2 quick examples of them. The first one I'm a bit biased to, which is Sentry. All right, we sort of made Sentry. Well, let's go through it. The first one was Sentry 1 for Fuel. All right. Then what we did is, over time, that we wanted to make some updates, so we actually made Sentry 2 for Fuel. Okay, and then that lasted quite well, and then we ended up taking a different direction. We actually decided to go towards Laravel at Catalyst. So we had 2.1, which was basically a rewrite of 2. We had Sentry 1 for Laravel, okay? And which was essentially the same as 2.1 for Fuel. We just switched out, using Fuel's config to using Laravel's config, from using Fuel's request to using Laravel's request, all that sort of jazz. Sentry 1.1, which was essentially a rewrite from Sentry 1. And my next package, which is OAuth 2, okay? So OAuth 2, and this one's quite interesting because this is literally just like the evolution of the same package across many frameworks. So of course it started off with Kohana, okay, and that was sort of the original sort of OAuth 2 package that so many people have used. From there, Phil actually converted it, ported it over to CodeIgniter. So I'm sure a few of you may have actually used it. And then from there, I'm pretty sure Phil wrote that too. You might know. Was it Phil who wrote that? Yeah. So then it got ported over to Fuel PHP. All right. So we've got 3 versions going. Just to add a little bit more fun, got ported over to Laravel 3. Okay. So now we've got 4 versions running, and there's a bit of a problem. The code diverged. Okay. So for the most part, you were just switching out, like, say, Fuel's request or their input class into Laravel's request or input class or whatever it was. Right. Someone finds a bug. Let's say they find a bug on Kohana. What happens? They fix the bug on Kohana, but the bug still existed on, CodeIgniter, Laravel, Fuel. So you sort of, up something creek. So yeah, I don't think keep the language nice. So yeah, and the other thing, of course, is as it diverged over time, it would, people would start to rewrite components of it and all that sort of stuff, and the API changed. So that posed a problem because here's our first scenario. Let's say you work with Laravel, okay? And then a client comes and asks you, oh, I've got this old CodeIgniter site you made for me 2 or 3 years ago. I need to add Facebook support, right? We need to do the things you do with Facebook, whatever it be. The problem was, you now work with Laravel, now you have to go and search CodeIgniter add-ons, work out what actually worked with CodeIgniter. And of course that takes a lot longer because you have to firstly find something on their store or on Google, by Googling it, you implement it, you learn what's changed, you get it all working, and it took you 3 times as long as it should. That's kind of annoying, and it also can be a bit of a business problem because you might go and quote the job up at, say, 5 hours, and then it takes you 10 or 15, you're losing money. So there's actually an economic downside to it as well. Another scenario, you work with Laravel, and they ask you to integrate Tumblr with their CodeIgniter site. And there's, say there's nothing, because Tumblr's OAuth 1, and really, there's not a whole bunch of OAuth 1 packages. Everyone sort of skipped over to OAuth 2. I say that, but I've just spent the last 3 or 4 weeks writing an OAuth 1 package. So you resort to using PHP's horrible curl API, and if anyone's ever dealt with that, it's almost as bad as death itself, but you get through it. And of course, has anyone ever done this last one? File get contents. Has anyone ever done that to talk to an API? It's just like file, and then you got the @ symbol to silence it. Yeah. You're not being honest. Most of you have, all right? And the job took 5 times as long as it should. That's grim, all right? So Composer came to save the day. It lets you deframework. So by this I mean, a lot of packages have now come out that let you use them wherever you would like, all right? And that decoupled your code, because what you would do is, yeah, because you're not relying on a framework, you just put this package anywhere that ren PHP and you're good. And you know, it also, yeah, let you unify code. So they're basically three ways of saying the same thing, but you sort of get the gist. So with Sentry, we had 5 flavors, and we've now got 1, okay? And the idea is that you don't need a framework to use it, okay? So, and we'll get into that in a little bit more, but we have deep integration with 4 frameworks, and of course, native PHP. So, OAuth 2, the same sort of thing. We had 4 different things, and it's now gone down to just 1. There's no integration with any framework, because frankly, it's not necessary. It doesn't need to be, and it could be, but for the package itself, there's no need. So, I'm not finished because there's more. You're doing it wrong. And I say that and I hope you're not going to start throwing stuff at me, but a lot of you are doing it wrong. Okay? Some of you are. I shouldn't say a lot of you. Most of you guys are probably doing it right, but there are some people who are doing it wrong. So, I did a quick search on packages, in fact, about 10 minutes ago, and it's around 540 packages. Lots of them actually require Laravel/framework, which is the entire framework of Laravel. And many others actually use a bunch of stuff from Laravel, Facades, and all that sort of jazz, even though they don't actually specify it. So there's a problem there. Why? Stop. You're not doing anyone favors, all right? There's no need. And I'll be really careful saying this, and don't take this as like, you know, the gospel, but generally speaking, there is never a need to use Laravel/framework as your dependency, ever. Unless you're building an app. Okay, so if you're distributing an application, yes. If you're making a package, never, within reason. Here's a scenario. You're a developer. And this is sort of where I want to get a little bit interactive. So if we maybe get the microphones ready, I would just like to have an idea of how, if you had to implement a new feature in your app, what's the approach? Anyone got their hands up? So I come to you and I say, we need to integrate with Foursquare so that people can log in with Foursquare. How do you Anyone, how would you go about that if I came to you with your existing website? Anyone got any ideas? Yeah, so packages, absolutely. So you would search on packages, right? You've got to discover the package, or as a developer, and let's be honest, we're all lazy, so you want to minimize your workload as much as you possibly can. And that's a good thing as well, because the more you can minimize your workload, the more productive you are, and of course that means you can just get things done quicker, and if it's your business, that's great, because you're working less for the same amount of, you know, the project's worth as much. So, there's 3 steps to discovery, I believe, okay? The first one is you find and implement a package and use as is. Okay, so you need to integrate with Foursquare. You're probably going to want some form of an OAuth 2. It depends if they're logging in. Yeah, you might want some form of an OAuth 2 package, and you probably want to find some sort of wrapper for the Foursquare API. Okay, that's great. That's the best case scenario, because that might take you 10 minutes to add Foursquare. You've charged the client 3 hours. Everybody wins, right? Actually, no, everybody doesn't win. You win. You reduce your workload and you increase your productivity. If this is a personal project, you're just doing it faster, right? You can spend more time learning the next thing. Step 2. So if you've won at step 1, you don't keep going. But step 2, the package is missing a few required features, okay? So let's say it's dealing, and I have no idea where the Foursquare API is at. So let's say the Foursquare API is at version 3. Is it version 3.1, but your package only does version 3, and you need a feature from version 3.1. Doesn't have everything you need. What you should be doing is sending in a pull request for those missing features, okay? So the reason that you would do that is you're helping improve the package for everybody else, okay? So you're not only just fixing it for yourself and hacking it together, but you're actually helping the community. The next person that needs something from the 3.1 API has it, okay? And of course, just before everybody said that packages, like you'd search on packages, right? That's open source, and that stuff comes to you at no cost. So you're actually giving it back. If you can contribute back to a package, that's great, because it helps everybody. All right. The next step is the package works, but it's not necessarily easy to set up with your framework. And has anyone ever dealt with that? And this comes down to a lot of the stuff that Jeff was talking about yesterday with dependency injection and all that sort of jazz. You know, and a great example. You know, it could be something like aesthetic. Has anyone ever used aesthetic before? Hands up. Yeah. And you set up your collections and your filters and seriously, it's like that much. It depends what your screen is, doesn't it? But on a normal screen, it's like a lot of code to set up. You set up your caching, you set up your collections, you set up any assets that you want, you set up your filters, and then you throw it out. Now that's kind of cool, but it takes a lot of code, okay? And it's a bit of a learning curve because I'm sure that there's probably people who have come to, as an example, aesthetic, and thought, no, I will skip it because it's just too much work, okay? What should we do at this point? Probably send a pull request with an integration with your framework, okay? And that can be done through a service provider. It could be done through drivers, which of course we'll talk about very soon, or a bridging package, okay? So we'll get into those very, very, very shortly. I'll go over them in great detail, but that's basically what you should be doing. If you can't make it work, if it doesn't work easily and you want to make it easier, help everybody else and do a little bit of work, yep? So, why make your own? Okay, so this talk sort of sounds like I'm just telling you to never innovate and never do your own thing, but no, there's actually a bunch of reasons why. If you fundamentally disagree with the API, that is a really good example. So if the API is just so wrong, in your opinion, okay, because it's a very subjective thing, if the API just doesn't behave how you expect it should, then it's probably a good idea to start your own. But what you should probably do first is get the community involved and ask them, does version 2 of your package look like, you know, could we change the direction a little bit? Yeah, definitely get the community involved instead of just like snapping and branching out and starting your own thing, all right? Stability. Is the project too stable to accept your changes? And the best example I can give you, and you can all relate to it, is Symfony. Symfony is so incredibly rock solid, and I very much doubt the chances of being able to just radically change it because you want something to function differently. There's so many people that utilize it. Yeah, so sometimes that is a problem, is that the package just doesn't want, the direction of the package just isn't the same as yours. And stubborn. We've all been there. You've tried to put in a pull request and you've just been shut down, but that's okay. So that's when you can start the wheel. Reinvent the wheel, which Taylor Otwell did. Okay, so and that's a great example. You know, and I'm sure Taylor, you've got a bunch more reasoning, but the way I see it is that Symfony does everything so well. Why would you bother changing? Because Symfony's hard to use. Okay, it's complex. There's a learning curve. But Laravel utilizes a lot of Symfony. I'm really sorry that I'm repeating a lot of stuff from yesterday. I wrote this up before yesterday, and then I'm like, oh crap, you know. But don't get too bored. Symfony, yeah, if I could sum it up in 4 words, I'd call it stable, powerful, complex, but pure. Okay. Laravel simplifies a lot of Symfony. Okay, and you hear this terminology, convention over configuration. And what that means is instead of giving you, and a good example could be the config. Symfony lets you use YAML, XML and PHP. Laravel does PHP, all right? That it gives you a lot of direction and because there'll be arguments like, what's better? Should I use XML? Should I use YAML? Should I use PHP? You know, it's sometimes having a convention and this is how it works. Sometimes that's easier. And of course that lowers the learning curve with the use of facades and all that sort of jazz. And of course the API is a whole bunch different to Symfony's. You know, Taylor, I think we used to joke about how much you loved closures, like you love those things, but they're really nice and they make it easier to read your code, usually. And yeah, of course, Laravel wouldn't be as far as it is along without the use of Symfony. But there's reasons against making your own. As much as there are reasons for it, there's a few reasons against it. It's time consuming. Does anyone here have like a sort of reasonably well-known package on Packagist or something that they started and they're maintaining? And I know a few of you do. Anyone? Anyone wrote a package and put it on Packagist? Yeah. It takes a while, doesn't it? Even the most simple things, they don't take 10 minutes. You know, like it could be a really simple package and it still may take 5 or 10 hours. I mean, Sentry, Dan, you'll vouch. We've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours on Sentry. It just takes a while. The other thing is, and this might be worded wrong, but it can actually, what happens is if you start making a second package, people start jumping ship and you've got two they're almost competing. And the problem is, is that someone comes in that's new, and that which direction do you take? And that leads into the third one, which is your responsibility to the community. So if you start a package and 6 months down the track you go, nah, stuff it, I don't want to make it anymore, but you've all of a sudden got 300 developers using your package on a live site, you kind of have a responsibility to maintain that package for them, okay? Or let someone else take over. But that comes down to split the community. Someone comes in and goes, should I use Sentry? Should I use Laravel? Or should I use Authority? If one of them stops and everyone's using that, or few people are using that, they're sort of in a bit of a pickle, okay? So you've really, and that's probably one of the most important things, is you have an obligation when you're making open source code to the people that are using it. So we're going to make it a little bit easier. I'm going to, and I hope it's easier, it's probably the world's most ugly flowchart. But, all right, we're just going to go through it a little bit. So this is, I just wanted to give a couple of examples about, you know, maybe a couple of packages or a couple of problems you have to solve, and maybe even some that I've worked on, and sort of how you can get to doing one or the other. So the first question is should I make a package? And this, of course, is talking about the third step of discovery, that, or failing the 3 steps of discovery, that I can't actually find anything. So, are there any packages that do anything like what I need to do? Anything, okay? So if you're doing authentication, are there any packages that do anything remotely related to authentication? Yes or no? If there's none, you kind of have to start one, okay? But if there is, there's a lot of other questions we've got to ask ourselves before we decide what to do. Next one, and this leads off like 3 or 4 talks you've already heard, you know, in the last day. Is the package well written and tested? Yes or no? So if the package is not well written, say, I really can't name names because I'm going to get people hate me on the internet and I'll just be banned. But there's no badly written packages that I know of that I would say, but sometimes there's a package and it may have been developed a few years ago, or might have just been ported from a really old school package from the days of pre-composer. And it might not be well written, okay? So let's say it's not. Let's say, no, it's just terrible. Is the API beyond repair? So could you work with the API? Say the package is quite badly written, but the API itself's all right. That may lead for the possibility to send in a pull request at some point. People that are using it, not much effort to change over to the rewrite that you may have, and you've got an existing code base, all right? But if the API is beyond repair, you kind of have to start fresh, okay? There's sometimes not a lot you can do. And then if we move down, could I send a pull request or maintain a fork? So that leads off what I was saying. The API might be all right, but you just need to rewrite the whole thing. Sometimes that's a good thing to do, okay? And if you can do that, we're good. But let's say you can't. The last question you've got to ask yourself, and this is a really important one as well, is it really feasible to start from the ground up? And that comes back to time consuming. And it is really, it's a big question, because if you're doing something for your clients, you need to ask yourself, is this going to take an extra 10 or 20 hours that I'm paying a developer for, or that I'm doing, that's that much better? Like, is it going to make my tea for me in the morning? Is it going to be that much better than what exists? And if it is, then start, all right? But if it's not, you can work with the package, okay? So yeah, that's the sort of the flowchart. Like, I could give you an example, okay? Please don't shoot me, anybody. Should I make a package? And it is one that I just did recently. So, and I'm going to talk about OAuth 1, okay? There was a couple of other packages that did exist, all right? And they were quite good. In fact, one of them was really good, and I don't know how to say it, but it's like Lustian or something. Lucitian, I don't know, OAuth. And it's a really, really, really good package. So yes, we come down. Yes, there's a package, and yes, it's quite well written, but it didn't do everything that we wanted it to do, and it wasn't really, it just wasn't set up exactly how we wanted to use it. We sort of wanted to simplify it a bit. It did a bunch of awesome stuff, like it took care of your storage, and it was really, really good. I just wanted something a little bit more lightweight, just a little bit. So what I wanted to do is send in a pull request, and I sent in a few pull requests, and we had a few discussions, and some of them are still like open now. What we ended up deciding to do was start from the ground up with that package. But that's okay, because sometimes there's a need for it, okay? But other times, just, you know, for the sake of starting from the ground up, it's not worth it. I could give, there's a few examples, you know, there's examples of packages out there which are Laravel specific packages which do the same job as existing packages that already exist. And that's not the best thing to do, usually. In fact, nearly always, that's not the best thing to do. And so that leads into the next part of the talk, which is my tips for package development. And this doesn't go into a whole bunch of depth. It's just a few basic sort of, thinkers, all right? First one, this is the most important thing when you're developing packages. And I say packages and not apps. Forget your framework, okay? And that's kind of hard because we're at a Laracon. But forget your framework. Laravel doesn't even matter when you're making a package. Just forget it even exists, all right? You want to develop outside of your framework, all right? TDD is a great way to actually achieve that, okay? And I'm not even going to go into that because you've already heard all about it. And yeah, just use native or naked, depending on how you want to describe it, PHP. So if you're making a package and you're not using TDD, which is fine, don't use a framework. Just develop with just like, the way I would do it, and the way I do it if I'm being a bit of a cowboy, is I'll have just an index.php file. I'll include my stuff that I'm working on, and I'll work on it that way. Just no sort of recollection or knowledge of what a framework is. The problem is, I would say maybe 80% of the packages that exist only use Laravel's. These are probably the three biggest sort of things that people rely on within the context of Laravel. So the first one is the input or the request, which are the exact same thing. And the second one is config, so like grabbing config, how does a user want the package to work? And the third one is the validator. And to be honest, in the context of a package, that is just a massive overkill for the sake of a package. First way we can get about this is using interfaces, okay? And our class and our method dependencies should be, in my opinion, should be interfaces. And Matt's going to kill me because he's just sat up there saying that traits. But in my opinion, I prefer to use interfaces because it doesn't matter it doesn't matter at all what implements it. As long as the interface is implemented and it has the methods, who cares what it is, right? And it allows for any implementation, which of course, I'm going to give an example of one of our packages. Okay, it's called DataGrid. And it looks all right. Cool. All right. So we have, within DataGrid is basically a very fancy, it's like data tables, except there's a really cool server-side API for it as well. One of the things that we need to use, of course, is we need to talk to the current request because you're going to send in filters for sorting your tables. You're going to send in search parameters and all that sort of jazz. All right. So this is a snippet of our interface. All right. So we've got a method getFilters, which returns a bunch of filters that someone's put in the request. GetSort, so that is like the column. Sort of pretty. It's really straightforward, right? The first implementation that we did was native. Okay. So this is basically PHP. Never worry. We built the whole package without any relation to Laravel at all. Just use native PHP. All right, and quite often that's great because at that point there is no requirements at all for your package except for PHP. And then of course, at the end, once we had that all working nicely, we integrated it with Laravel. Okay, so and I'm not going to go into the depth of that. They've already talked about it. You inject Laravel's request and you use it. Okay. That comes down to dependency injection. There's a billion resources out there on that. One other example I'd like to talk about is Sentry, okay? And this is sort of how we get so much support out of the box. I'm going to talk a little bit about our cookies, okay? So when we're storing cookies, every framework has its own sort of method of storing cookies, right? And the reason is there's mainly security and convenience. You can hide the contents of your cookie just by giving out an ID and you store it server-side. It's really cool. So the same sort of thing, all right? Everything in Sentry, like seriously, every component of Sentry is driven by an interface. So you've got your methods here, all right? So the key is the key, like the cookie key, whatever, like the name of the cookie. You've got your put forever, and there's like retrieve and all that sort of jazz. All right. So the first one that we did, of course, was native PHP, and it's pretty straightforward. And I'll zoom down a little bit, and of course, it's literally just your old school set cookie. All right. So no integration with a framework at all whatsoever. And it means that we have no requirements of any framework. The second one, of course, what have we got here? CodeIgniter. All right, CodeIgniter. So you probably all recognize the input set cookie sort of stuff in CodeIgniter. Same deal. We use it in Sentry. We inject it in. It works beautifully. What else? This looks like Fuel. All right, we've got Fuel. Exact same thing. All right. Illuminate, which is, of course, the core of, what's this framework called? Laravel. Sorry, I've talked about all these frameworks. I forget which one I'm at. All right, Illuminate. So it's the same thing. All right, this essentially is the same as like Cookie Make. All right, except we're not using facades. And of course, we have Kahana, which is, I forget what his name was, but this bloke came and just like added all this support for Kahana, like, and it was really awesome, and good on him. I loved it. So, interfaces, it lets you build your package framework agnostic, and then integrate through what I call drivers or implementations, okay? And always start framework agnostic first. So always start with your native PHP where possible. And sometimes it gets a bit complex and you can't do that, but most of the time you can. Service providers. Okay, so service providers, they should be used to set up your package. All right, so that's a point of entry for a framework, you could call it. Okay, that's where you would, you reduce your work for your consumers, because as everybody knows, when you want to use input get, that's all you type, right? You don't actually have to set up the current request, and as Fabian was talking about yesterday, you don't have to set up your HTTP kernel, any of that. You just use input get, and everything's just there, right? So you reduce your workload for your consumers, which are you guys who would be using a package, right? This is where you inject your config. And that's something that a lot of people miss, is that all your config, and I mean all of your config, should be injected at this point, okay? You may inject it to your own little package-specific repository, that's cool, but that's the endpoint for where the framework is, where your package should be tied to a framework at all times, and that's basically a given. If anybody disagrees, throw your hand up, and I won't, just yell it out to me. If you disagree with me, throw your hand up, don't throw things at me. All right, facades, okay? They don't need to be complex at all. And Phil, obviously, wherever he's gone, covered them, all right? But they don't need to be complex. They can be quite simple, and I'll give you an example of them. It's a pretty ordinary facade, and don't do that, because that is probably like, that's like the epitome of slow code, but that gives you an example, all right? So basically, yeah, this is a dumbed down version of our facade for Sentry in Fuel. You've just got a core static, okay, which is just a magic method that lets you call any method statically on your class. You've got an instance method which sets up Sentry lazily, returns it, and usage is just like that. So you create a class alias, and then you just call your method. And it appears to be, that's basically our setup guide for Fuel, is you just put a class alias and you're done. And that's it. And of course, your Sentry fine user 1 would be the same as Carteless Sentry, facades, Fuel PHP, Sentry, instance, fine user 1. It's a lot that's going on under the hood, but it makes it easier for people to use your framework. And of course, that helps you, because we'll get onto that. Cool. And facades should only be referenced from an app level. And that's really important, okay? That's a really, really, really important thing. So a lot of the time, and as I was saying with your config, your input, and your validation, people reference facades from within a package. That should never happen. That should always be injected. The problem is, even if someone's using Laravel, okay, and they're using Laravel with your package that's Laravel specific, they might not have, for whatever reason, they might not have that facade registered in their config. So just because they're using Laravel 4 doesn't mean they've got any of the facades registered at all. So that's something to keep in mind. So here's a little bit of, and this of course is not gospel, but don't do that, do this. It's just like, this is what some people do, as in like a made up example, and this is what you could do. So don't. This is the sort of thing I was talking about, using facades, using config, and you've probably seen something like this before in a package that you've worked with. You've got cart, so you've got a cart class, and one of the methods is to adjust. It might add some tax, it might add a surcharge, that sort of thing, all right? You don't want to be doing this because of all the reasons I just stated. And of course, this would be how you set up your cart, all right, your service provider for your cart thing. Try this. So instead of using config anywhere, we have a set surcharge method, and we have an adjust method which works on the surcharge that's been set in. And that is set in the service provider by grabbing the config out there, okay? So by grabbing this config and injecting it into our cart, which is done here on line 12, we use that. It doesn't need to be in Laravel. Like, you could just, the equivalent of that in native PHP, which I may have even done. No, I didn't. All right. It is new cart, and it's basically line 5 and 6. That's all it is in native PHP. So it's not like it's adding a whole bunch of workload to people who aren't using a service provider. Never reference, yeah, there you go. I've already said all that. I jumped ahead of myself. Here's my next don't. All right. Now the same sort of thing, and I see this quite often as well. I've seen a few different auth packages naturally because I'm in that game. Is we've got an auth package, we've got a method that says login, and we're just using input get username and input get password. It seems pretty easy when you're writing the package, but of course that means that no one else who is using Fuel, like, or using Symfony or even Zend, can use it. All right. So that would be how you use it. But what I would probably suggest is this. Okay. There's no. You're sort of delegating the responsibility back. There's no reference to your outside, and of course that would be one way to do it. And of course natively would be the same. All right. There's not a lot to it, but it's just little things like that, and there's not much work. It really doesn't add that much more work for your consumers, but it means that you're widening your audience a lot. So, yeah. Cool. What's my next one? I made a few of these. Sorry, I didn't realize how many of these I made on the plane. Okay, a validator, all right? And I see this a lot as well. People are using the validator like this. So we've basically said, oh, age has to exist, and it has to be numeric. And that works. That works quite well. Our validator's fully unit tested. It's great. Why don't you try that? You don't need to and that's something that I actually had a discussion with a few developers when I was making Sentry. I was like, do we use the validator? Like, do we require that as part of Sentry because it's really useful? But at the same time, I don't think it's necessary. Sometimes that's fine. And then what you can do in your app is that's where you can. The only real advantage of the validator is it's easy to make rules. But for simple rules like that, I don't think it's necessary. You can have your localized error message back in the app. You could go, if user doesn't check, like so if, that's where you give your localized error message. Easy. Cool. So, package design. There's two ways you can make packages that enable people to easily integrate them. First way, I like to call them drivers, and that's sort of what we do a lot of our stuff with Catalyst. So everything's uses interfaces, all right, which helps you with your solid, which of course, can anyone name the solid? Like it's like single responsibility. I don't know, no one knows them, but solid. All right, Taylor talks about it in his book. Multiple implementation. So whatever framework, no framework, doesn't even matter. All right. And it makes it more plug and play, and I hate using that word because it feels like one of those old school, remember you had your plug and play printers and all that with Microsoft XP, or Windows XP. And then of course there's a lower learning curve. You expose yourself to a larger audience. So with Sentry, we've exposed ourselves to Laravel, Symfony, Fuel, CodeIgniter, Kohana, no framework at all. And a lot of our users aren't actually using Laravel. Even though we're typically known as a Laravel package, they're not using Laravel, and that's great, in a sense. In a sense, that's great. So yeah, another example is Laravel's database package. There's an example right within Laravel. So what Taylor did when you're doing your schema builder, for example, or your grammar for selecting, he's just got a grammar interface. I don't know if you've all looked at it, but basically you got your PostgreSQL SQL in like implementation, your MySQL, all that sort of stuff, or MySQL if you're American. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I just did that twice for fun. Bridging packages. So that's what I like to call, and a great example. If anyone use Symfony here? Yeah, of course you have. Anyone use Twig within Symfony? Of course you have. Twig itself is a bundle that has no reference to Symfony, but there's a Symfony Twig. Twig is a package which has no reference to Symfony. But then there's a Symfony Twig bundle which integrates them. Okay, so Twig itself can be used in Laravel, and there's a Laravel Twig bundle, all right? It can be used outside of it, but there's a nice integration, okay? What that does is allow to keep the core light, because if you start integrating with, say, the top 20 frameworks, you've got a hell of a lot of files, right? And in every single class that you use the interface for, it gets quite heavy. So keeping the core light, letting people manage their own implementations, it's kind of cool, all right? Especially once you've got a lot of frameworks, because the frameworks are always updating. I mean, you managing that's just a job in its own. Yeah, there you go. Laravel's mail package, all right, is essentially just a bridging package for Swift Mailer, okay? So if you've ever looked in the core, essentially all it's doing is just adding a nice fancy closure, utilizing Laravel's views and calling Swift Mailer. That's all it does, all right? It's good, Taylor. It's not all it does, but it simplifies it and it just bridges that sort of gap. All right. Bridging packages are drivers. That's the other thing to know, okay? is that it's the same sort of concept. You're just separating it. All right. Yeah. There's sort of the controversy in the talk. All right. Yeah, same code, different packages, and of course, it's the same sort of thing. It's impossible to include all the drivers if you're managing it. And of course, people can put in pull requests, but that's you got to maintain it. You got to be there around. You go on holidays, you upset everybody. So, why bother? Well, helping the community. All right. So, by making a bridging package or implementing a driver, you're helping the community. The community always helps you. So it's that giving back thing again. Anyone have a go at saying this? Interoperability. All right. It's like that PHP fig. I can't say that word really well, but basically it helps with productivity because going back to our example of where you're a developer and you need to implement something in another framework, that you don't have to relearn the API. It's just there, right? It's sort of like PSR. I mean, we could ask tabs or spaces and there'd be a big fight, but it helps. At the end of the day, it just helps. Having something consistent that goes throughout just helps you, and and why not, So it's easier to be lazy. All right, so you might, as an example with the auth that we were talking about, it's easy just to go input, get username, input, get password, done. But in the long term, it's not, okay? It ends up becoming a pain. The framework updates, all right? People are using other frameworks, right? So as an example, say Taylor goes and changes a whole bunch of stuff between 4.1 and 4.2, and then you have package breaks. It's not easier. It really isn't, okay? All you'd have to do is modify your service provider and you're done, okay? An argument that a lot of people have is 2 packages are slower, and they're not, okay? So people will say, oh no, I've now got Twig and I've got Laravel Twig, and that means that Composer is going to fall over. It's not, okay? Composer doesn't really care about how many packages there are. It just cares, it's just directories, right? So you're just loading another directory, and really in the grand scheme of things, that's not a whole lot. And as Matt talked about, you can actually optimize your classes into the one flat file, and I do know how that works. Laravel makes it easy. You put it in your config and it's great, all right? Or something like that. Actually, maybe I don't. You put it in an array somewhere in some magic file and it just works. It's really cool. So yeah, summing up, too long didn't read. Basically, contribute to existing packages where possible, because that's great. That helps the community. Forget all frameworks when making a package, and that's really important. If you can take one thing out of my lesson, my talk, my rant, is that forget all frameworks when making a package. Okay, that's probably the most important thing. All right, speeds up, it decouples your code. You're not dependent on a framework. It speeds up those 3 steps of discovery, okay, because people may just find a package at step 1 that works, done. All right. We allow so we code or we design our packages to allow for easy integration. We use interfaces where possible. You can make a bridging package. All these things strengthen the community, all right? They're not hurting the community, they're only strengthening it. People working together make a package stronger helps everybody, and that's so true. And of course, don't forget, I'm not just sitting here and saying never innovate, never change. There are reasons for starting fresh, okay? And there are very good reasons for it, but just be mindful that you get a responsibility, And of course, as every talk leads to, and I kind of like this, I wanted to finish on this just because I thought it was kind of ironic, it's a per case basis. So there's no wrong and there's no right. It just matters for what you're doing, okay? So for your package, that's it. You just got to decide. Don't you love that? When people go on about tabs or spaces, and it's like, well, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but it's just food for thought. So I hope you enjoyed my talk, and thank you very much. So I guess at this point, this is where I ask you, does anyone disagree? I would actually like someone to disagree with me and say I'm wrong and give me an example. I would love that. Can someone disagree with me, please? Oh, here we go. No. All right. Yeah, Mike over here. I would love to hear, yes.
I was looking at the... Is it working, yeah?
Yeah, okay. It's working.
I was looking at the interface you made for the cookie and the input.
Yeah?
And I was wondering, those are the 2 things that maybe don't add a lot of value for, making different implementations besides the native one. Isn't get
You probably
enough?
shouldn't... Yeah, so that's the thing, is that it's almost not worth worrying about making the extra implementations. Just make it for native, And that comes down to making your, like, forget frameworks, make the native implementation. Then if you use a framework, are you a Laravel user, a Fuel, what do you, Laravel, make a Laravel implementation and forget the rest. People that want it will come and make their own implementations. It doesn't mean that you have to then spend, like, you spend, like, say, 50 hours making the package, that you have to spend another 100 hours implementing it for every framework that's conceivable. Don't do that. Just native, that's what I do. Native, Laravel, and then if someone else wants it, I mean, at Catalyst, you know, our subscribers ask for it, we build it for them. But if, you know, if someone else wants it, they can put in a pull request. Yeah? So that's cool. Yeah, I agree. It's not worth spending 1 billion hours trying to please everybody in the world. So, any others? Someone tell me I'm wrong. I want someone to tell me that I'm wrong with something like, you know, you suck, Ben. Heckle me. No, don't heckle me. I hate that.
So it's not so much disagreeing as adding something, but
Yep.
when you mentioned that, like, if the API of something sucks, you should, like, start over if it's beyond repair.
Yep.
I'm just thinking, like, pretty much all the packages, they're actually built upon the shitty API of PHP in a way, like, you know. So, I mean, like, there are good examples like Guzzle or Buzz, for example, that just build onto pair, onto curl, which really, like, is not nice to use. So if you find something that works, but just with a shitty API, maybe it's like, maybe rather than reworking the entire thing, just like add a dependency on that and kind of wrap it into a nicer API.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes, yeah, I agree. And quite often I've had to do that. I'm not going to give examples of where I've had to work with shitty APIs, but yeah, absolutely. Quite often. And that comes, like, developers are lazy. At the end of the day, you just want to get your stuff done as quick as you can. And yeah, I fully agree with you that if there is a, you know, a crappy API, you could just wrap it or work with. If it works and it's terrible, I mean, there's no point fixing what's broken unless you just want to, like, become like a zombie and just dedicate your life to making a new package. And sometimes I've heard people that have made some interesting and great packages, and, you know, a lot of them may say, if I had my time over again, maybe I wouldn't have done it. Just because there's so much work involved. And there's a lot of work involved in maintaining a package, especially once it starts to take off. But at the end of the day, I love it. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Hey, so I really liked your flowchart, but I think you skipped over one very important aspect of it.
Sure, let's go back to it.
So that's the point where I kind of disagree with you. Like, your flowchart doesn't take into account that if you start over, you're bound to make the same mistakes that the original maker already made.
Absolutely.
And probably solved. So in your case, you're saying I implemented a new OAuth 1 package.
Yes.
But have you ever thought about what if you do it wrong? Like,
absolutely. And that was one of the hardest things. Absolutely. The reason that we did it is, seriously, this other, I'm not saying this other OAuth package is anything less than mine. It's probably better. But the only reason we did it was because we didn't want to worry about making it deal with all the storage and all that. That was just a bit over the top for what we needed. And yeah, but absolutely. I mean, it's at version, I don't even know if I've released a stable version yet. So it's probably full of bugs. And absolutely. And that's another thing, because it takes time. And, you know, if someone starts using it, like starts using our PHP League package, then we've got an obligation to maintain it. You know, once someone starts using it, and that's a very, very, very good point, is that I'm bound, there will be bugs in it for sure that they will have found and fixed. So yeah, that's a very valid point. Be careful and mindful of when you restart something that you're gonna make bugs, and you're gonna make some guy's life hell for an hour or a day trying to debug what you've got wrong. But yeah, that's something you've definitely got to consider. And that weighed on my mind when we started it for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, I actually have a question myself.
Sure.
It's not something you covered, but it's actually more like common sense.
Yep.
Whenever I come to our package and I want to use it, it's often that I find like the only documentation that's available for the package is like a GitHub README file. It's like really short.
Yeah.
And I want to use the package, but I don't know really how to. How important do you feel that documentation is for a package? Because
depends. That's a good question for everybody, and that's why we need awesome documentation writers. how do you guys learn most of packages? Like, hands up if you. I like to just look at the code and the tests. That's actually how I'll read the README, but quite often you just look at the tests. Anyone sort of do that? Yeah. So maybe what, a third of you? Yeah. Okay. So what about who's happy with just a README and just going in and seeing what works and what doesn't? See, we're lazy. All right. And what about like full documentation? I mean, full documentations, who finds that the only way that you can really learn how to use a package is proper, good, full documentation? See, isn't that interesting? There's your answer. Personally, I like to, I mean, full documentation, depending on the complexity of the system. Once it gets complex, yeah, docs are needed. But personally, I just try and read through the code base. It's probably the stupidest way because it's probably a hell of a lot slower. But yeah, there's your answer of a biased audience of Laravel developers. But yeah, got one down here. Why does everybody do that? Gonna hide from you.
Just because I'm an Aussie, Jesus.
Can't stand you people.
Actually, just a comment on that. I find back in the Rails community, the Rails guides is probably the best documentation I ever came across.
Yep.
And surprisingly, AngularJS is probably the worst ever, especially on directives.
Yeah. So and that made it easier, or did you find that Angular was that much harder to learn because of that, or?
Oh no, yeah, Rails is definitely easier. AngularJS, once you got to a certain point, then it was really good. So once you kind of felt like you started to become an engineer just by reading through their stuff.
Yeah, and it was that entry point, wasn't it? Yeah, finding an entry is sometimes quite hard. Anyone else? I want someone to just tell me I'm blatantly wrong. Can someone just do that? But no, and I guess Jeffrey said it really well. Don't take anything that I've said as gospel, because I mean, I really don't know I don't know anything more than any of you guys at all. I just was stupid enough to put my hand up and say I'll do it. But anyway, cool. That's all. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.